This is Green Street, the environmental health show, greenstreetnews.org. Patti and Doug Wood and our worldwide network of experts here every week to keep you up to date on what is happening that you need to know to keep yourself and your family safe in this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back. Every day around the world, hundreds of billions of tiny animals go to work for us, pollinating crops that produce our food. They show up faithfully, work long hours, are highly skilled, and cost us nothing. All they ask in return is for us to protect the natural world in which they live and on which they depend. But despite their enormous value, in fact their indispensability, we're not holding up our part of the bargain. Today on Green Street, we'll talk with a scientist who recently led a team analyzing the plight of pollinators around the world and what can be done to help them and ourselves before it's too late. I remember when I was a kid, every summer our whole family would pack ourselves into the car and off we would go, camping or visiting distant relatives or maybe some family reunion or something. And after a long drive, the car's windshield would be covered with the remains of the hundreds of insects that got in the way as our car sped down the highway. We don't see that anymore, the result of a dramatically shrinking insect population as development, chemical insecticides, climate change, and other factors have taken a tremendous toll on these tiny creatures, some of which are annoying and some of which are absolutely critical to our own survival. Dr. Tara Cornelisse is the lead zoologist at NatureServe, where she brings over 15 years of experience in entomology and conservation biology to this nonprofit science-based organization. An expert on pollinators, Tara was the lead author on a recent study which revealed that more than 22% of native pollinators in North America are at an elevated risk of extinction. Patti and I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Cornelisse earlier this week, and we started our conversation talking about her background. Here's our conversation with Dr. Tara Cornelisse.
My background is in ecology and conservation biology. That's what I studied as undergrad and then also as a graduate student. I got my PhD at UC Santa Cruz. I had always loved insects. They've just sort of been my love since I was a kid and always interested in conservation. And so luckily I was able to kind of marry the two at school. And after I finished my PhD, I had a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History where I was working actually more on conservation education because I was also very interested in teaching and education and advancing that as well. But I was kind of missing the real focus on insects. And then this position at NatureServe as first the invertebrate zoologist came out, and it just was kind of like the Goldilocks position for me, where I was really able to bring my knowledge of entomology and invertebrate zoology, and then combine it with, fantastic science being done, but also at the same time, like a very applied science with a nonprofit organization.
So tell us a little bit about NatureServe. I wasn't really familiar with the organization until now.
So it kind of started out as a sort of data arm of the Nature Conservancy, I think back in the 80s or maybe even late 70s. And basically, NatureServe is really unique in that we're kind of the central hub of a series of network programs. So each state and each province and territory of Canada have their own kind of network program. So like the New York Natural Heritage Program is an example of that. And a lot of times they are called natural heritage programs. And so those programs in each state on the ground are responsible for tracking species and collecting data on their habitats, their ecosystems, and the species that occur in their jurisdiction. And then NatureServe is kind of like the data hub for all of that information.
I see.
And then we kind of put it all together and create products that we can then give back to them to help do conservation, make conservation decisions, as well as kind of scale it up to federal organizations, agencies as well for them to make decisions too.
Cool. Okay, so Tara, you've made a bit of news with this study that you did. Tell us about the study. First of all, let's back up for a second and talk about what is a pollinator. Because I think a lot of people think of honeybees and they don't think beyond that, but that's just the beginning, right?
Right. Yeah. Honeybees are obviously a very important agricultural pollinator. Honeybees are not native to North America. We have mostly the European honeybee in the United States that's used as kind of an agricultural animal. It's sort of trucked around,
Yeah,
to areas
yeah.
where it's needed. And so it is an important pollinator for agricultural systems for sure. But there are so many other pollinators. Honeybees are just a few species of many, up to like 4,000 native bees in North America, probably around 20,000 bees in the world. And then bees are just one pollinator as well. We also have butterflies, moths, lots of beetles pollinate. Flies also are really effective and important pollinators. And then not only insects, we also have vertebrate pollinators. So like hummingbirds and bats are important pollinators as well.
Even small mammals are pollinators, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's like some rodents that can, be found in flowers that sort of stick their face in them and will transfer pollen. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of pollinators. Really, and so really that kind of goes to the definition of pollinators, which you can then imagine how many other species are pollinators. It's really just an animal that visits a flower usually to consume some kind of floral resource, usually nectar, but also pollen. And then as a result of visiting that flower, it moves pollen from one flower to another, effectively aiding in the reproduction of the plant.
Got it.
So there you go.
So what prompted this particular study? And tell us a little about the study.
Yeah, so you may be familiar with, there's been, unfortunately, in the last around 10 years, a lot of news about insect declines all over the world. There's been some studies looking at declines of insects in Germany, in the tropics, in the United States. And unfortunately, there's been more and more, and the consensus has kind of been that, we're losing about maybe 2% of our insects annually. And so we knew this, as conservation and entomology professionals. And we also have noticed that in a lot of these papers, pollinators seem to be really taking the hit kind of more than other insect groups, and they're declining a lot. And pollinators are extremely important for not only pollinating crops, but also pollinating wild plants where they create habitat for other animals, as well as food for other animals as well. And so knowing these kinds of two things, we were really interested in using our NatureServe status assessments to try to figure out what is the status of pollinators in the United States and Canada. And there's been a lot of studies that have looked at specific groups of pollinators, maybe bumblebees or butterflies or moths kind of separately, but we were really interested in looking like across the board, how are pollinators doing in our region that we track. So that was kind of where we were coming from. And NatureServe is sort of uniquely suited to kind of answer this question because we have these network programs that are on the ground tracking these species. We have this conservation status assessment methods where we have this rank calculator where we figure out what is the conservation status of these species. So whether they're secure, imperiled, vulnerable, that kind of thing. So we have all these fantastic data where we realized that we could create some kind of larger scale analysis to figure out how pollinators are doing.
So why are pollinators declining at such an alarming rate? I mean, what are the top 5 reasons for this?
Right. So we did, as part of our study, not only did we analyze sort of the percentages of the at-risk species for extinction in these pollinator groups, we also looked at the top threats. As part of our ranking system in NatureServe, we also put threats in. And the top threat that came out was climate change for pollinators. After climate change, agriculture came out as the next top, as well as development. And then we also have changes in fire regimes or hydrological regimes. Those are together as a threat, and then invasive species.
Why agriculture?
Pesticides.
So agriculture is kind of a big category of a threat. Right. And there's a couple of reasons. One is basically outright loss of habitat. So conversion of prairies, of woodlands, of shrublands that are important habitats for pollinators to crops. So we lose all of that floral biodiversity that the pollinators depended on, as well as the other habitat features, such as, bare ground where they could potentially have nested or other types of areas where they could have nested. So you lose habitat. But also there's like the chemical inputs that go into agriculture. So pesticides are designed to kill invertebrates. And a lot of these pollinators are invertebrates. They're insects, right, which are a type of invertebrate. And so they are negatively impacted by the inputs to agriculture as well. And then also there's inputs like nutrients that are put in, fertilizers that are put in agricultures that can change the composition of plants within and around the areas as well.
So what are those nutrients? I'm interested. So you're talking about just your typical nitrogen and phosphorus and so on?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So are you looking at the issue of biosolids using the fertilizers that are coming from sewage sludge or wastewater?
We haven't dug deep down into that. We didn't really go down into the specifics of these broad categories of threats for this analysis. I am an author on another paper about pesticides and soil health, and so it doesn't necessarily look at phosphorus and nitrogen and inputs like that, but it kind of looks at the overall impact of inputs into the soil on invertebrates. And there's lots of studies showing that there's negative impacts. And 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. And so soil is a really important component of their life cycle.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I thought that, some of these nutrients and things were taken up by the plant, unwanted things, obviously, for pollinators, but I didn't realize that there's so many of them were actually nesting in the soil.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's talk about climate change and how climate change is affecting these pollinators. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's many ways climate change is impacting pollinators, mostly through changes in temperature and precipitation. For butterflies, for example, we found that most of the at-risk species were in fact in the West, but also kind of in the Rocky Mountain region of the West. And we have many beautiful montane butterflies that overwinter under snowpack. So the adult butterflies will lay eggs, and either those eggs or sometimes the eggs will hatch and the caterpillars will come out, and those stages are the ones that actually will survive over the winter under the snowpack. And so you can imagine that snow is really important to the survival of these species because it creates this insulation.
Sure.
As snow melts, you have less of that protection, so they're more exposed to kind of that like frigid, cold winter air that they might otherwise be not, or ice instead of snow as well. So that can really be detrimental to these butterfly populations that do that. Drought is also another really big issue that can cause loss of host plants. A lot of our imperiled native bees are specialists on certain types of plants, sometimes families of plants, sometimes different genera of plants. So they need really specific types of plants to carry out their life cycles to survive and to reproduce. And so if those plants are impacted by drought, maybe they have fewer flowers or just fewer plants from year to year due to droughts, that can really take a toll on the populations of bees as well.
Nature's pretty good at adapting. Are you seeing any evidence that insects and other parts of the natural world are trying to adapt to a changing climate?
Yeah, there have been some studies that have shown that populations of bumblebees, for instance, are surviving more in kind of northern or higher elevation areas. And so, we're thinking that they're shifting. And bumblebees are a great model for that because they're generally generalists. And so in contrast to kind of those specialist bees, they actually are able to utilize a lot of different kinds of flowers. And so they are able to shift around a little bit more than some bees or pollinators that are really specific to that one kind of plant.
But not other species besides the bumblebees.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. We have butterflies. I'm in California, and we have butterflies here that have kind of a boom and bust life cycle as well, where when we do have really wet years, they'll come out in really high numbers. And so that's one way they can kind of track the changes. The worry there, is if you have a series of really dry years, are they going to be able to survive that in the stage that they're kind of in what we call diapause or sort of hibernating and waiting for those wet years to come. And so hopefully they'll be able to adapt to the point where they're able to survive longer periods of drought and still be successful when we have those rain events.
Who are the natural predators for bees?
For bees, it kind of depends on the bee, but it can be a lot of different kinds of predators. So birds, reptiles like lizards, spiders, wasps are actually a good one. They also have parasites and so parasitoids. So like tiny little parasitoid wasps are flies that will lay eggs in them as well.
Nature is just so interesting. I mean, everything is connected. It's all just so fascinating. I mean, you've told us so many things that I think are, well, they're new to me, and I thought I knew a lot, but hopefully new to our audience as well,
Yeah.
which is, really just makes us understand how fragile, the ecosystem is, and how we just really need to be appreciative of the work that all of these little tiny things that we don't even think about are doing on our behalf,
Yeah.
helping put food on our table.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you made me think of kind of contrary to the native pollinators that were, interested in conserving, adapting well to climate change. We're finding that honeybees are actually like being more successful becoming feral in the warming climate. So there's something called Africanized honeybees. So there's a native species of honeybee to Africa that is also used agriculturally and will hybridize with the European honeybee. And so then they sort of become what they call Africanized honeybees. And they're a little bit more likely to leave sort of domestic settings and become what they call feral. And so kind of go out and create their own hives. And then they'll kind of set up shop in these natural areas, maybe like national parks or BLM land. And those are really important areas for like native bee habitat. And so if the honeybees get out there and they're out in the wild, then they really are able to outcompete and sort of take up all the resources for the native pollinators. And so that's something that could happen because they seem to be adapted to warmer weather. And so as sort of that warmer weather creeps up from sort of southern Arizona and southern New Mexico, they're kind of coming along with that.
Yeah. So Tara, did you come up with any conclusions? So you did this study. You looked across the whole world of insects, and what kind of recommendations did you come up with?
Yeah, so we came up with recommendations at different levels. So there's places that folks can do things on their own in their own homes. There's places that, we can have policymakers do and land managers do as well. And so for policymakers, it's important to integrate these at-risk pollinators that we found in our study into management plans. So if we know which species are in fact most at risk of extinction, then those species can be put on lists of what we call like species of greatest conservation need. And those species are the ones that will directly become important parts of management plans in different states. And then they'll also be able to receive funding as well, which is an important part of conservation. So that's something that folks can do. Land managers can really help prioritize conserving habitats, making sure that there's areas of wildflowers, areas of flowers as much of the year as possible. I know some areas that freezes over, so you can't have flowers all year long, as well as to try to conserve native habitat as much as possible, particularly like grasslands and shrublands and woodlands, where we found that, these are really important habitats for pollinators, as well as reduce inputs such as pesticides and fertilizers as well. And then for folks at home, people can really make a difference, creating your own gardens, even if you just have like a balcony, for instance, with native plants, making sure that you buy plant starts or seeds that are not treated with pesticides. Unfortunately, a lot of seeds and starts out there are treated before you even buy them with pesticides. And obviously that's kind of creating what we call like an ecological trap where you're drawing in the pollinator, but at the same time, you could be killing them with pesticide exposure. Folks can also, turn off lights at night. We want to think about our nocturnal pollinators like moths and bats. Leave the leaves is another really important one. So if you have kind of an area where you get leaves or down vegetation, maybe in the fall, for instance, it's really important to leave that in place because those are the places where a lot of these pollinators are, in fact, spending the winter, and they need that cover to protect them to survive. Being part of citizen science projects is another really important component of that, or community science projects, where folks contribute data, basically. You know, a lot of the data that we use in these studies has come from platforms like iNaturalist, where we get this information about where species are and how many there are. And so we can use that information to analyze the status of the pollinators too.
I have two huge corners of my property that are just all native plants. And it's great because we live on Long Island in New York and we don't have a lot of exciting things to see, but I sometimes actually see hummingbirds
Oh, neat.
right out my window and lots of butterflies. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's wild looking. And then it looks terrible because we do live in a place where, we have seasons and then it just kind of all disappears in the fall, and the winter it looks terrible.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's okay with me.
Good. Yeah.
Because right now it's just like unbelievable. I mean, it's like wild, both sides of my property. So
Oh, how beautiful.
Yeah, it's neat.
Yeah, people just, it would be great if people could get comfortable with messy, because we need those twigs and leaves, and even if they're brown and dead, like that's where, we have the pollinators spending the winter.
Nature knows what it's doing. So let me ask you this question. Are you optimistic? I mean, you're witnessing in your own lifetime a significant decline.
Yeah.
What's your prognosis here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, honestly, I fluctuate between being optimistic and pessimistic, depend on the day, or what I'm reading or what studies are coming out. As you had alluded to before, nature is adaptable, and there are some evidence here and there where we're seeing species adapting to some of these changes, but they're occurring really fast. Climate change in particular is the one that really concerns me. It's, a little bit at this point kind of run away. And so we are going to be expecting more increases in temperatures, more fluctuating precipitation, more droughts. And those are going to really impact species and pollinators in particular as we go forward. So I am quite concerned about that, to see what kind of changes are happening. I hope that there is some adaptability, and the fact that we can make some difference on the ground. There's some studies coming out that are showing that habitat mitigation, so actually like creating habitat, or what they call like refugia, areas of shade, areas of host plants, creating this habitat is actually able to offset a little bit of the negativity of climate change that's happening. So that does make me more hopeful, and I hope that people can embrace that a little bit more as part of the solution. Yeah, the nice thing about working on insects is that you can really make a difference in a small area. And so that does kind of keep me hopeful.
Dr. Tara Cornelisse, lead zoologist at NatureServe, talking about the plight of pollinators and their impact on our food supply and the larger natural world. You can learn more about Tara and her work at NatureServe at the organization's website, natureserve.org. You can also find out more information about all of our news items today and hear any of our past shows at our program website, greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for our show today. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Tara Cornelisse, and all of you who listen to and support this show. I'm Doug Wood. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.